History hides shadows far darker than we are often taught. Behind plantation walls, inside dimly lit slave quarters, and beneath the cruel laughter of overseers, acts of horror and defiance unfolded that blurred the line between justice and vengeance. These are stories soaked in blood, whispered in secret, and carried through time like curses. Tonight we descend into one such tale from New Orleans in 1746, where a woman enslaved and tormented by cruelty turned the night into a scene of unrelenting terror. In the year 1746, New Orleans stood as one of the most complex and dangerous places in the colonies, a city where the rhythms of French influence, the pull of Catholic tradition, the constant hum of trade, and the brutality of slavery all collided in narrow streets and sweltering plantations. The Mississippi River carved through the land like an artery, carrying with it wealth and bodies, both willing and unwilling, to feed the ambitions of those who sought to build their fortunes on the backs of others. New Orleans was not yet the romantic city of music and masquerades that people imagine today, but rather a settlement thick with tension, where the smell of blood and sweat was never far from the sweet perfumes of imported goods. The year itself was marked by uncertainty, as France sought to hold its colonial grasp while its subjects bent the law to their advantage, exploiting every resource they could, none more tragically than the enslaved men and women who formed the invisible backbone of the city. These individuals were dragged from African coasts, sold like cattle, and cast into a world where survival meant endurance and silence, for even whispers of rebellion could mean death. The plantations that stretched along the riverbanks were not lush gardens of prosperity, but prisons without walls. The earth yielded crops of sugarcane and indigo, but the cost was human life, spent quickly beneath the lash of overseers and the oppressive heat of Louisiana's sun. Nights were no gentler. Insects swarmed in the humid air, the cries of the punished echoed across the fields, and the sense of hopelessness pressed down heavier than chains. It was in this climate of violence and despair that the story of Mary, an enslaved woman, begins to take form. But before her tale of vengeance could unfold, one must understand the soil in which such fury was sown. The French colonial government maintained a strict code, known as the Code Noir, dictating how enslaved people should be treated, but on paper law was one thing, and in practice it was another. Overseers, often hired from Europe or born of rough stock in the colonies, carried out their duties with an iron hand, pushing bodies to the brink in pursuit of profit. Whips cracked as easily as laughter in the taverns of the French Quarter, where these same overseers drank away their wages and spoke of human beings as though they were tools or livestock. The cruelty they inflicted was not random but systematic, designed to break the spirit as well as the body, to ensure that no enslaved person could rise against the machine of power that sought to devour them. Mary lived in this world of contradictions, where the grandeur of Catholic churches stood tall against the suffering of those forced to build and maintain them. Every day was a march between fields and quarters, from the harsh orders of the overseer to the scraps of food, barely enough to sustain life. Women in particular suffered doubly, for they were not only beasts of burden, but also targets of abuse, their bodies taken at will by the same men who drove them to exhaustion in the fields. The overseer assigned to Mary's plantation was known for his drunkenness and cruelty, a man who believed himself untouchable beneath the laws of France and God, who ruled through fear and violence rather than justice. He was the embodiment of colonial power gone rotten, his whip a constant reminder that the enslaved were never safe, even in the quiet hours of the night. To exist in New Orleans as an enslaved woman during this era was to live at the intersection of horror and survival. The French Quarter, with its taverns and gambling dens, offered temporary escapes for men like the overseer, but for Mary it offered only the looming threat that when he returned, drunk and reckless, his cruelty would escalate. Alcohol was both his weakness and his weapon, a poison that stripped away restraint and left only the raw, violent impulse of a man who saw others as beneath him. This toxic combination of drunken rage and unchecked authority set the stage for the unthinkable act that would later unfold. The backdrop of 1746 also carried whispers of resistance. Stories passed quietly among the enslaved about uprisings in other colonies, about men and women who refused to bow, about the possibility of a life beyond chains. Though spoken in hushed tones and hidden behind fearful glances, such tales provided fuel for those who dared to dream of freedom. Mary, like many others, would have heard these whispers, perhaps imagining what it might mean to strike back against the very hand that inflicted her pain. New Orleans, with its swampy outskirts and labyrinthine streets, was a city where secrets could fester, where vengeance could be plotted in silence, where one act of rebellion could ignite fear in the hearts of the powerful. The overseer, drunk more often than sober, had become careless, believing his dominance eternal, convinced that fear would keep Mary and others in submission. But fear has its limits, and desperation can transform it into something sharper, something that waits for the right moment to reveal itself. That moment would not come in broad daylight, nor in the public square, but in the private hell of the overseer's own quarters, where his drunkenness would betray him, and the roles of predator and prey would reverse in a single, unforgettable act. The setting of 1746 New Orleans is not simply a backdrop, but a living, breathing character in this story. The oppressive heat, the rigid hierarchy, the sound of chains rattling against wood, the cries of the punished mingling with the laughter of masters, all of it contributed to the atmosphere of dread that permeated Mary's world. To understand her act is to understand that it was born not out of sudden madness, but from years of cruelty, degradation, and the ceaseless reminder that she was viewed as less than human. The plantations of New Orleans, with their towering oaks and sprawling fields, were nothing more than gilded cages, and within them the enslaved carried wounds both seen and unseen, until one among them chose to strike back in a way that would never be forgotten. Would you like me to now expand the keynote No. 2 Kean into the same style, around 800 words, focusing entirely on Mary herself and her background? Mary's life before the night of vengeance was one shaped entirely by the chains of bondage and the suffocating grip of a system that saw her not as a woman, but as property. Born into slavery, her earliest memories were not of freedom or family warmth, but of the endless toil of the fields, the sting of overseers' commands, and the constant fear that her body and her spirit were never her own. For women like Mary, survival was not simply about enduring backbreaking labor, but also navigating the constant threat of exploitation by those in power. She learned early that the world she inhabited was one where silence could mean survival, where every glance and every word carried the potential to provoke punishment, and where the smallest spark of resistance had to be hidden away like a forbidden flame. Her hands bore calluses from sugarcane and indigo, her back bore scars from the whip, and her eyes bore the heavy knowledge of a life lived under the weight of oppression that never allowed her to forget her place as dictated by her captors. Mary carried within her the memories of her mother, who had been taken from Africa, and whose stories were passed down in fragments whispered in the shadows of the slave quarters. These whispers were all Mary had to connect her to a world before bondage, a world of rivers, villages, and traditions erased by chains and ocean voyages. Her mother spoke of ancestors who had resisted invaders, who had not bowed to cruelty, and though those words were hushed for fear of being overheard, they left seeds inside Mary's heart. Those seeds did not wither even as her days were filled with torment. Instead, they grew into a silent strength, a quiet endurance that waited beneath her suffering like a storm waiting for the right season to break. Mary's body was not her own in another, more sinister way. Women in bondage lived under the constant threat of being taken by force, used as objects of desire or punishment by overseers who saw themselves as masters not only of labor but of flesh. Mary endured this reality. The nights when the overseer stumbled back from the tavern, his breath thick with liquor, his eyes heavy with cruelty, and his body reaching for her, not as a man reaches for a partner, but as a predator reaches for prey. Each of these encounters etched rage deeper into her soul, a rage that she did not display outwardly but carried within her, shaping her into a vessel of endurance and eventually vengeance. Unlike many who broke beneath the constant weight of this life, Mary possessed a quiet will that allowed her to conceal the storm within. She learned to read her overseer's moods, to anticipate his anger, and to mask her emotions so carefully that he never suspected the fire smoldering behind her silence. This ability to conceal her true thoughts was her greatest weapon, for while others lashed out and were brutally punished, Mary became a shadow, blending into the routine of labor, while quietly observing the overseer's weaknesses. She knew his habits, the times he drank the heaviest, the moments when his arrogance left him careless, and the times when he was most vulnerable. This knowledge, gathered in silence and born of necessity, became the foundation of her eventual act of defiance. Her life was also shaped by the small, fleeting moments of solidarity among the enslaved. In the slave quarters at night, she listened to stories, songs, and prayers that bound them together in a fragile web of community. While the overseer believed fear kept them divided, these moments of whispered connection reminded Mary that she was not alone. She heard of others who had resisted, of women who had struck back in small ways, of men who had run into the swamps and disappeared into freedom. These stories, though often ending in tragedy, were lifelines, reminders that resistance was possible even if the price was high. Mary carried these stories inside her, allowing them to fuel the resolve that grew steadily over the years. Her strength was not only in her endurance but in her ability to turn her pain into purpose. While others saw her as broken, as merely another body to be worked and used, Mary cultivated her own inner world, one where she was not defined by chains but by her unyielding will. Her silence, often mistaken for submission, was in fact the sharpening of a blade, an invisible preparation for the moment when the overseer's cruelty would finally tip the balance and push her from survival into defiance. She carried herself with a stillness that belied the storm within, her gaze downcast when the overseer looked upon her, but her mind sharp and calculating, taking note of every detail, every weakness, every slip in his drunken arrogance. Mary's relationship with the overseer was the defining torment of her life, and it was through this relationship that her eventual act of rebellion would be born. His drunkenness was not a secret. The entire plantation knew of his habit of drinking himself into a stupor. His arrogance allowed him to believe that no harm could come to him, that his position and his violence rendered him untouchable. But Mary, more than anyone, knew that his drunkenness was not only a weakness, but an opportunity. While others shrank back in fear when he staggered about with a bottle in hand, Mary observed, waiting for the night when his guard would be so lowered that the tables could finally turn. She bore within her the weight of years of cruelty, degradation, and hopelessness, yet she also carried the quiet knowledge that even the most powerful could bleed, even the cruelest could be humbled, and even the overseer who had taken everything from her could be brought to his knees. The seeds her mother planted, with stories of resistance, the songs sung in secret, the scars that burned like brands across her skin, all of these things built the foundation of a woman who, though enslaved, refused to let her spirit remain shackled forever. Mary was not merely a victim of her circumstances, but a vessel of silent wrath, waiting for the moment when silence would give way to action and endurance would transform into vengeance. Would you like me to move on and expand? Keynote No. 3, in the same detailed 800-word style, focusing on the overseer as the predator. The overseer who held power over Mary's life was not simply a man doing his duty, but a figure who embodied the brutality and corruption of an entire system that thrived on cruelty. He was a man who had come to New Orleans seeking fortune, yet lacking the wealth and refinement of the French elite. His only means of rising in the colony's hierarchy was to exert dominance over those with no voice. Men like him were often drawn to the position of overseer because it granted them unchecked authority, a chance to indulge the darkest impulses under the guise of discipline and order. In his hands, the whip was not just a tool of labor, but a weapon of terror, used not merely to enforce productivity, but to remind the enslaved that their bodies and lives were at his disposal. His very presence carried the stench of fear, and every step he took across the fields was a reminder to the enslaved that violence was always a breath away. His nature was worsened by his addiction to alcohol, which was both his pleasure and his poison. Nights in the taverns of New Orleans left him staggering back to the plantation, his laughter turning to slurred commands, his arrogance inflamed by the liquid courage in his veins. For the enslaved, his drunkenness was never a relief but a threat, for drink stripped away even the thin veil of restraint he occasionally wore in the daylight. When sober, he was cruel. When drunk, he was monstrous. His eyes glazed with intoxication, he would lash out for the smallest slight, inventing reasons to punish those he already despised. Men would be beaten for failing to meet impossible quotas, women would be dragged from their quarters to satisfy his lust, and the children who cried out were silenced by the reminder that their parents were powerless to protect them. His drunken rages carved fear into the very air of the plantation, leaving the enslaved to anticipate not if, but when he would erupt again. The overseer had grown confident in his position, for he believed himself untouchable. The master of the plantation relied on him to keep order, and as long as the crops were harvested and the work was done, little attention was paid to the methods he employed. In this way he was given free rein to indulge every cruelty, his violence justified as discipline, his predation overlooked as the natural order of things. He relished this authority, mistaking fear for respect and mistaking silence for submission. He would walk through the rows of enslaved workers with a swagger born not of true strength, but of borrowed power, his whip cracking against the air not only to drive work forward, but to remind every pair of eyes that met his that he could do as he pleased. Mary, like many others, endured his wrath time and time again. He singled her out often, not because of her weakness, but because of the strength he sensed within her. Her silence and endurance infuriated him, for he mistook it as defiance. In his drunken state, he sought to break her spirit in ways beyond the lash, believing that by forcing himself upon her, he could assert ultimate control. To him, she was not a human being but a vessel through which he could affirm his dominance, a body to be used whenever his cruelty or his lust demanded. These violations became yet another layer of torment in Mary's life, another wound carved into her body and soul, and yet he remained blind to the danger of pushing a woman so far beyond the threshold of endurance. The overseer's arrogance extended beyond the plantation. In the taverns of New Orleans, he bragged openly about his control over the enslaved, boasting of how easily they bent to his will. He wore his cruelty like a badge of honor, laughing with other overseers about the punishments he inflicted, reducing human suffering to a form of entertainment. These drunken boasts revealed the true nature of his character, for he did not see himself as a guardian of order, but as a predator who thrived on fear. The more he indulged in alcohol, the more reckless he became, returning to the plantation with less caution, staggering into situations where his vulnerabilities became visible even to those he sought to dominate. There was a certain predictability to his habits, and Mary, forced to endure his presence more closely than most, came to know them intimately. She saw how the bottle dulled his senses, how his grip on the whip loosened, how his once calculated cruelty gave way to sloppy, careless violence. She recognized the slurred words, the stumbling gait, the way he would collapse into drunken sleep with little regard for his surroundings. These moments, though terrifying, revealed cracks in the armor he believed impenetrable. He had built his power on fear, but fear was not enough to protect him when his body failed him, when his mind dulled to the point that even the enslaved could see the man beneath the monster. What he did not understand was that power built only on terror is fragile. It endures only as long as the victims remain broken. Mary was no longer broken. Each act of cruelty he inflicted upon her became fuel for the fire that burned within her, a fire he was too blind and arrogant to recognize. He believed she feared him as the others did, never realizing that her silence was not submission, but observation, her stillness not weakness, but waiting. He mistook her endurance for defeat, and in doing so, he signed his own fate. The overseer was a man consumed by excess of power, excess of cruelty, excess of drink. His life was a testament to the corruption that thrived in a system where human beings were reduced to property, and where those entrusted with authority were often the least deserving of it. In his drunken arrogance, he could not see that the very patterns of indulgence and cruelty that defined him were the same patterns that would lead to his undoing. He could not fathom that one of those he sought to dominate, a woman he had tormented and defiled, was watching closely, waiting for the night when his weakness would finally outweigh his strength. For all his brutality, all his posturing, and all his swagger, he remained blind to the truth that even the most feared predator can become prey when arrogance blinds him to the dangers lurking in silence. Would you like me to continue with the keynote no fora next, expanding the act of revenge itself into 800 words in the same horror history style? The night of vengeance arrived, not with a storm or the clash of arms, but with the slow, inevitable descent of darkness upon the plantation. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and the echo of crickets in the swamps beyond, a night no different from countless others, and yet it carried with it a weight that only Mary seemed to recognize. The overseer had once again returned from the tavern, his gait unsteady, his voice slurred, his arrogance swollen by the liquor that dulled his senses. He barked a few commands to no one in particular as he staggered through the yard, the whip dragging lazily behind him, and the enslaved who caught sight of him knew to keep their heads bowed and their eyes averted. To them, it was another night of dread, but to Mary, it was the night she had long prepared for. The night when years of silence and endurance would finally transform into something far more terrible. The overseer stumbled into his quarters, a place that symbolized both authority and depravity, where punishments were ordered and cruelties carried out, but also where he often collapsed in drunken stupor. Tonight, as he muttered curses under his breath and tossed aside his boots, Mary followed the familiar steps, called to him not as a woman, but as his property, expected to obey his demands without question. She entered the dimly lit room, where a single lantern cast a wavering glow, illuminating the overseer's face swollen and flushed with drink, his eyes barely able to focus on her form. He laughed, a sound that blended mockery with desire, and reached for her with the same confidence he had carried every night before, never imagining that she might have come not in submission, but in resolve. Mary's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of what she was about to do. The years of torment, the nights of violation, the endless lashings and commands, all pressed upon her in that moment, sharpening her resolve into a blade as sharp as any steel. She had seen him in this state before, vulnerable, weak, but never before had she acted. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, the fire within her could no longer be contained, and she moved not as a slave, but as an executioner. The overseer slumped back, his laughter turning to a groan as his head fell heavy on the chair. His hand reached lazily toward the table where his bottle sat, but his grip was clumsy, and the liquid spilled across the wood. He cursed again, his words slurred, and his body shifted to adjust himself, unaware that Mary had already begun her silent ritual. She moved carefully, her eyes never leaving his form, her breath measured, her hands steadying as she drew upon every memory of cruelty he had inflicted, every scar he had carved into her flesh and spirit. Each recollection fueled her strength, stripping away any final trace of hesitation until all that remained was purpose. In his drunken haze, the overseer did not register the change in her demeanor. He had always mistaken her silence for compliance, her stillness for obedience, and so he did not sense the danger that now loomed inches away. As he slumped further into intoxication, his guard completely abandoned, Mary struck. The act itself was swift and merciless, driven not by the frenzy of rage but by the precision of long-harbored intent. She took from him the very symbol of his dominance, the weapon he had wielded against her in ways far crueler than any whip or lash. The overseer's scream split the night, a sound not of power but of shock and agony, a sound that carried across the plantation and froze the blood of all who heard it. His body thrashed violently, his hands clawing at himself, at her, at the air, but Mary did not falter. She had endured his strength before, and now, in his drunken weakness, he was powerless against the force of her vengeance. The lantern light flickered, casting shadows across the walls that danced like specters bearing witness to the retribution being carried out. The overseer's cries grew hoarse, his voice breaking into whimpers that no longer resembled the commanding bark of authority, but the pitiful wails of a man who had been unmade. His arrogance, his cruelty, his years of unchecked violence, all of it drained away with the blood that pooled on the floor, a grotesque testament to the reversal of power that had taken place within those walls. Mary stood over him, her chest heaving, her hands stained, her eyes burning with a mixture of fury and liberation. The man who had tormented her, who had believed himself untouchable, now writhed in helplessness, stripped of the very thing he had used to dominate her. In that moment, she was no longer the enslaved woman he had sought to break, but the embodiment of every silent scream, every hidden wound, every unspoken prayer for justice that had been carried by the enslaved on that plantation and beyond. The overseer's screams carried into the night, and though the enslaved in their quarters dared not move, they listened, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and awe. They knew something had happened, something unimaginable, something that would change the way they remembered this night for the rest of their lives. The silence that followed his cries was heavy, oppressive, and filled with the weight of an act so shocking that it would live on, not as rumor, but as legend whispered in shadows. Mary did not flee, nor did she collapse in exhaustion. She stood rooted in place, watching as the overseer's strength ebbed away, his drunken confidence replaced by the raw, unfiltered terror of a man facing the very mortality he had long believed himself above. The room smelled of blood and sweat and liquor, a mingling of corruption and justice, of cruelty and vengeance finally answered. The overseer, once the predator, now lay undone at the hands of the woman he had underestimated, the woman whose silence he had mistaken for defeat. Would you like me to continue with Keynote No. 5? Next, expanding it into 800 words focusing on the horror and legacy of this act, told in the same style. The aftermath of Mary's act was not a single night's terror, but the birth of a legacy that would ripple through the plantation, through New Orleans, and through the whispered histories carried in the hearts of the enslaved. The overseer's cries, sharp and piercing, had torn the silence of the night in a way no lash or whip ever had. Those who lay in their quarters, bound by fear and silence, heard the sound of power collapsing, of a man once thought invincible reduced to screams that shook the walls of his own authority. For the enslaved who had endured his cruelty, that sound was unforgettable. It was horror, yes, but it was also a strange form of vindication, a reminder that even those who stood above them could bleed, could suffer, could fall. The overseer's condition left the plantation in chaos. His authority had been stripped as surely as his body had been, and though the master of the estate attempted to cover the scandal, the story could not be contained. Whispers spread among the enslaved, carried from one set of quarters to another, from one plantation to the next, until Mary's name was spoken in hushed reverence. To the enslaved, she became a figure larger than life, a woman who had dared to strike back when no one else could. To the masters and overseers, however, she became a nightmare given form, the embodiment of their deepest fear, that those they believed broken and submissive could rise in vengeance. The legacy of Mary's act was not written in books or recorded in the ledgers of the French colonial government, for such histories sought to erase or distort any sign of defiance among the enslaved. Instead, it lived in the oral traditions of those who carried her memory. Around fires in the quarters, mothers told their children the story of a woman who took justice into her own hands, who reminded the world that power was never absolute. It became a tale of both caution and inspiration, a horror story that blurred the line between fear and hope. Children shivered at the details of blood and screams, but they also carried with them the knowledge that resistance, however dangerous, was possible. The overseer himself was never the same. Broken in body and spirit, he no longer commanded the same fear. His arrogance had been gutted, and his authority faltered under the weight of humiliation. The very men and women he had once terrorized now looked upon him with a new gaze, not of fear, but of knowledge. They knew he was not invincible, that even he could be undone by the hand of one woman. This knowledge, unspoken but heavy, lingered like smoke across the plantation. It did not erase their chains or free them from the brutality of the system, but it gave them a weapon far more dangerous than any blade: belief. Belief that the cycle of cruelty could be broken. Belief that vengeance could find its way even into the most fortified halls of power. The French masters, upon hearing of the event, responded with the fury of men who realized their control was not absolute. For them, Mary's act was not merely the crime of a single woman, but a threat to the entire order they had built. Punishments were doubled, surveillance tightened, and the overseer's suffering was wielded as both a warning and a cover, meant to remind the enslaved of the price of rebellion. Yet fear can only go so far, and the more they sought to bury Mary's story, the deeper it rooted itself into the hearts of those who needed it most. She became a figure of terror to the overseers and a beacon of strength to the enslaved, a dual legacy that neither side could ignore. The horror of what she had done also lingered in the psyche of the city itself. New Orleans in 1746 was a place of contradictions, wealth and splendor for some, misery and degradation for others, and Mary's act forced those contradictions into the open. In taverns, whispers of the castrated overseer circulated among drunken men, half in disgust, half in fear. Among the wealthy, the story was spoken of with disdain, stripped of context, painted as savagery rather than justice. Yet no matter how they sought to frame it, the horror of the act remained, an indelible stain upon the narrative of control that the French masters sought to maintain. For Mary herself, the legacy was more complicated. She became a ghost in her own lifetime, her presence both feared and revered. Some enslaved women saw her as the embodiment of their silent rage, a sister who had acted when they could not. Some men saw her as proof that even the most feared authority could be brought low. And yet there was also fear among them. Fear of the punishment her act might bring upon them all, fear of the retribution that masters would unleash in the name of restoring order. Mary's name was both a prayer and a curse, a reminder of the high cost of striking back against the machinery of slavery. Over time, her act became something more than a memory. It transformed into legend, retold with variations, each version shaped to fit the needs of those who spoke it. In some tellings, she was a victim who could endure no more. In others, she was a cunning predator who waited for the perfect moment to exact her revenge. In still others, she was something almost supernatural, a spirit of vengeance who rose from the suffering of the enslaved to strike down cruelty where it stood. However the story was told, its essence remained the same. A woman had turned the tools of oppression against her oppressor, and in doing so, she had shown that horror could serve not only as punishment, but as a form of justice. The overseer's screams may have faded into the past, but the echo of Mary's defiance lived on, woven into the invisible fabric of New Orleans itself. In the alleys where shadows lingered, in the swamps where freedom beckoned, in the hearts of those who dreamed of a world beyond chains, her story was carried forward. It was whispered in fear by those who held power, and it was whispered in awe by those who longed to take it back. That is how horror becomes legacy, not through written records or monuments, but through the memory of the oppressed who cling to the rare, terrible moments when the balance of power shifts, when the enslaved rise from silence into vengeance, and when the night bears witness to justice written in blood.